Today, we're going to answer one of your burning questions about the Bible. Can angels be girls? Okay, that's probably not one of your burning questions, but it is something that we're going to address today. The main thing we're going to talk about, though, is God's plan for Babylon. You might say, well, Luke, God doesn't have a plan for Babylon. Babylon was destroyed by the Persians over 2,000 years ago. Babylon is old news. God said nobody would ever even set foot in Babylon again forever and ever. That's how irrelevant Babylon is today. So how can you, Luke, say that Babylon is going to make a comeback in the end times? Well, it's not just me who says it. John the Revelator said it, and the prophet Zechariah told us about this too. And you're going to be saying it too after you listen to today's episode of the God and His Prophets podcast. Welcome to God and His Prophets. This is a verse-by-verse study through the Bible's major and minor prophets. My name is Luke Taylor. Today, we're going to be looking at Zechariah's 7th night vision. This is number 7 of 8. In this one, it's got a lot of bizarre elements, but the meaning is going to be quite clear. Hope you all are having a great weekend. Where I live, the weather has gotten a lot nicer than it has been the past couple of weeks. We've had a great afternoon with the family. We played Ticket to Ride after lunch. And I just finished that up just a few minutes ago. And I hate to brag, but I kind of just dominated the whole battlefield. It's not really a battlefield, it's train tracks. But you connect these little routes across America. And I had the longest one and ended up winning the game. And I really wanted to take a picture of it and share it with you all. But conveniently, my wife took the board apart. She took all the pieces and put them away really quickly after the game got done. So I wasn't able to take a picture and show you all how I just totally blew everybody else away. That's why I drew this little picture here, and you can see I connected a route. It went from Vancouver to Portland to Los Angeles to Denver to Santa Fe to Dallas to Nashville to Pittsburgh to New York. I connected 5 routes, and in the last turn of the game, I got 100 points and blasted past everybody else. So anyway, I've been everywhere, man. And I'm feeling pretty good right now. Anyway, and if you can't see the map if you're listening on the podcast form of this tomorrow, so that's why you need to subscribe on YouTube. I try to put a little visual aid element here, and you're missing out on the little map I drew of my routes if you're just listening on the audio format. So sorry, I can't do anything about you there. Many call this vision in Zechariah chapter 5 the vision of the woman in a basket. I call it hell in a handbasket because that's really what is actually going to be conveying here in these verses that we're going to read. So let me pull my verses up. You can read them along with me, or if you want to grab your Bible and turn to Zechariah 5. I'm going to be going through the ESV version of the scriptures, and here's what it says. Then the angel who talked with me came forward and said to me, "Lift your eyes and see what this is that is going out." And I said, "What is it?" He said, "This is the basket that is going out." And he said, "This is their iniquity in all the land." And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, "This is wickedness." And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. And so let me stop at verse 8 for a minute. So Zechariah is seeing one of his night visions. So this is, it's kind of like a dream, this visionary experience that God is giving him. If you're kind of new to this, we're traveling through the book of Zechariah right now, and he has 8 night visions that kind of kick off his book. And so as we get into these visions, we're on the 7th one now, so we're almost all the way through them. And they're often full of a lot of symbolic elements, and we got to kind of decipher the symbols so that we can understand the meaning of what this vision is meant to convey to Zechariah and his readers. And so, again, there's a lot of strange symbology going on in this, but once we put the pieces together, the meaning is actually pretty obvious or pretty clear. So what Zechariah sees here is he sees this basket that's, I imagine it's suspended up in the air, floating in the air, and the basket is said to be holding all the sin of the land. And so the sin is being removed from the land. And we'll kind of talk about the historical context of Zechariah in a minute to maybe understand what this is talking about. But then as it says that the sin of the land is being removed, suddenly the basket, the cover of it opens up. And for a moment, Zechariah can see inside the basket. He sees this woman right there. So all the sin in the land is represented by this woman. And then the angel said, "This is wickedness," said it with a capital W. And the angel like pushed her back in and shut the basket. So he didn't want her getting out. And so that's not the end of the vision. Here's what happens next. It says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 2 women coming forward. The wind was in their wings, and they had wings like the wings of a stork. And they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, 'Where are they taking the basket?' He said to me, 'To the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there on its base.'" And so these 2 women who have, like it said, bird-like wings, they appear and they carry off the basket, and they're taking this woman of wickedness to a place that's being prepared in Shinar. And so it said the basket and the woman, they will wait there until there's an appointed time for this basket to make a comeback. So again, apocalyptic literature, these are all symbols for other things. And so now that we've kind of went through the vision and we kind of have all these elements of what's going on, let's break down what these things are. So it said it's going off to the land of Shinar, or that's where the place is being prepared for all this wickedness, this evil. Well, Shinar is Babylon, and I will show you that later in the scripture, but Shinar is Babylon. And so in the context of this book, what is the relevance of Babylon to the book of Zechariah? Well, in 605, this would be about 100 years or so before Zechariah was alive, 605 BC to 586 BC, Babylon invaded really this whole region of the Middle East. I mean, like, tried to conquer it all, basically. And Babylon invaded Israel. And so Babylon is what we would call a world empire. That's a phrase I like to use in the context of Bible prophecy when I'm talking about, it doesn't mean they literally controlled the entire planet. I mean, people in Babylon didn't even know about the Western hemisphere of the world, right, at that time in history. But when I say it's a world empire, it was an empire that basically dominated the world. Nobody was as powerful. It controlled so much territory, nobody could dare stand against it. And so it would just, and at this time, it controlled vast swaths of the ancient world. If you were king of Babylon, you were essentially king of the world. And so Babylon, key point, Babylon was both an empire and a city. All right? It was an empire. It was located in modern day Iraq, the city was, but it controlled a whole big area of like that region of the world. And then in 539 BC, so they had captured the Israelites and carried them off to Babylon, the ones who survived. And we covered a lot of this in the book of Ezekiel, which I previously did on this podcast. But they conquered Israel, carried off the Jews for 70 years, and they ruled the roost until 539 BC. And then Babylon as an empire was destroyed. So what happened was the Persians, and they were allied with the Medes, and the Persians and the Medes, so it's called the Medo-Persian Empire by some. Well, they went to the capital, the city of Babylon, and they cut off the river that flowed into the city, and then they invaded, and they slaughtered the Babylonians. Not actually, it was actually a pretty bloodless affair. They killed who they needed to kill to take charge, but they came in and just basically swept in and took over the place. And the Babylonian Empire is kind of said to have fallen basically in a night, that the Medes broke into the city and slaughtered who they needed to kill, including Belshazzar, who some say was drunk. And if you kind of read about this in Daniel chapter 5, you read about like his last night, and Belshazzar gets killed. He was the final king of Babylon. And then that was the end of the Babylonian Empire. All right? It was the end of the Babylonian Empire. I'll say that again, one more time. That was the end of the Babylonian Empire, but it was not the end of Babylon. So let's talk about Babylon through the ages, and we'll come back to Zechariah chapter 5 later, but let's just talk about Babylon's role throughout time. You see, the Bible, before Babylon fell, the Bible had prophesied that Babylon was going to be utterly destroyed, and it said this in a few key places. Isaiah 13 and 14, as well as Jeremiah 50 and 51. So this was before Zechariah's day, okay? Because Zechariah is part of these Jews who got to come back. The Persians released them back into Israel after the Babylonian Empire had fallen. And so Babylon had been in control of Israel for a while, but Zechariah is part of that crew who gets to come back. So we'll come back to him. But before all that, the Bible had prophesied that Babylon is going to be toast someday. So toast, the Bible said nobody is ever going to live there again. Isaiah 13, verses 19 and 20, it reads, "In Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there." So clearly, the idea right here is that Babylon is just going to be left in utter wasteland. Okay, it said like nobody's having a picnic on Sodom's ruins, right? I probably would because that would be kind of neat, but like normal people, they don't see Sodom as a tourist destination. And this prophesies that the same is going to be said of Babylon. Like it's going to be left a wilderness, and it said it will never be inhabited. Okay, look at those words, Isaiah 13:20. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. So this is prophesying that Babylon is going to be toast, okay? But has this actually been true of Babylon, the empire, or the city? Okay, well, clearly the empire had its end because they lost all their power, but Babylon, the city, continued to exist. It was still inhabited in the days of the Persians. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 6, and Nehemiah lived during the Medo-Persian Empire. It says, "While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king." Now, Artaxerxes, he was not a Babylonian. Artaxerxes was a Persian, but he lived in the city of Babylon. And so that's why he said Artaxerxes, king of Babylon. So Babylon continued to be inhabited during the days of the Persians, the next world empire that came after Babylon. Then during the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great, he not only intended to make Babylon his capital city someday, he literally was in Babylon whenever he died. He was living in Babylon. He was living, I think he died, in the palace of the former king Nebuchadnezzar. That is where Alexander the Great actually was at the moment he died. And then during the Roman Empire, the next world empire to come along after the Grecians, Peter acknowledges in one of his letters, he's writing to a church, that he makes reference to a church in Babylon. Let me start at 1 Peter 5:12. This is at the end of the book where, at the end of the epistles in the New Testament, they'll often give some shout outs. And it said, "By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it." In verse 13, "She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings. And so does Mark, my son." She who is at Babylon. So there was a church. Some say he might be referring to Mary, the mother of Jesus. That is possible. Something is going on in Babylon, though. If it's Mary or if it's a church, someone, regardless of who she is, the point here is Babylon. There was a city of Babylon that was still in operation during the days of the Roman Empire. And the gospel had a strong enough presence in that city, they actually had a church established. I mean, hallelujah, that's glorious. Okay, Babylon, this city of rebellion against God, they got conquered by the gospel in the days right after the days of Jesus. And so Babylon, as we can tell from these verses in the New Testament and in the Old, Babylon continued to operate as a functioning city in the days of Persia, in the days of Greece, and in the days of Rome. So let me go back for a minute to Isaiah 13:20. This is what had been prophesied. "It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations." Now, did this come true of the city of Babylon when the Babylonian Empire fell? Did that happen in 539 BC? Obviously not, okay? Centuries later, it is still inhabited even at the time of Jesus. There are scholars who will look at those verses that I read from 1 Peter 5, and they will say, he was not speaking of literal Babylon because Babylon had been destroyed, just as Isaiah 13 said, just as Jeremiah 50 and 51 said. So they say there couldn't have been a church in literal Babylon. He's speaking symbolically of Babylon, okay? Because again, some people take the Bible very literally, as I do, and some take it really spiritualize a lot of the language. But I don't think Peter was speaking in code. I think he was actually talking about Babylon, the city, And as we can see from the witness of the Old Testament, Babylon continued to be used as a city even after the empire had fallen. So what I am saying is that I'm not saying Isaiah 13 was wrong. I'm saying it has not reached its total fulfillment yet, okay? It's maybe, you could say it was partially fulfilled when the empire fell, but Babylon, because Babylon, the empire was destroyed. The destruction prophesied did happen, but I don't believe it's been 100% devastated yet, as the city is still, it can still be in operation even after the empire fell. Now, some might say, well, Luke, maybe the city didn't fall immediately, but it's effectively been irrelevant for the past couple thousand years. I mean, ever since the days of the Roman Empire, when Rome fell, people didn't live in Babylon after that. So why are you saying that Babylon is still relevant? Is God really going to come along and destroy it again? Well, I believe that Babylon is going to have a role to play in the end times, and that it will actually be the capital of the Antichrist's empire. All right? And so let's talk about Babylon in modern times. So some of you might not know this, some of you might, but Saddam Hussein, he actually started a restoration of Babylon in 1978. And I've got a picture here I can share. If you're watching, you know, if you're going to miss out on things like my Ticket to Ride route that I drew for you, or if you're just going to listen on the podcast and that's fine. I actually try to make these as audio friendly as I can. So if you want to look on YouTube here, though, I have got actually a picture here of the modern day Babylon. And I think this is really interesting that Saddam Hussein actually started a reconstruction project in 1978. And so he actually started rebuilding the city of Babylon. There is actually a whole CNN report that I've got the video saved. I can't show it because I'm afraid I'll get a copyright strike on YouTube if I just replay the video, but you can go look this up. CNN did a report on this. And here is a quote from something called the World Monuments Fund. I think it's connected with the UN or something. They say thousands of people reside in Babylon within a perimeter of the ancient outer city walls, and communities in and around them are rapidly, this is a quote, rapidly developing from compact, dense settlements to sprawling suburbia, despite laws restricting constructions. So people still live in Babylon today. All right. And if you look on the picture on the screen, even over on the left side, you can kind of see some little people there, because it's kind of hard to tell how big all of this is. It doesn't look very tall, but if you see the people over in the picture on the side, you can see like these are actual buildings. Kind of looks like a maze or something. But anyway, Babylon is being rebuilt. Now, the work on it stalled, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but the work on it did stall after Saddam Hussein passed away. We'll talk about that. But here's what I find so interesting about the fact that the reconstruction of Babylon has already begun. It's been in place for decades. The book of Revelation speaks about the Antichrist using this city as his headquarters, okay, during the 7-year tribulation that is yet to come. It says this in Revelation 18:1, at the end of the tribulation, as Jesus is having the second coming, okay? And the world empire of the Antichrist is falling apart. Here's what it says. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. And some note that it says here, fallen, fallen. Why does it say that twice? Well, some say because it's really the second time that it has fallen. The empire fell 2,500 years ago, and then the city itself, which will be this headquarters of the Antichrist in the end times, the city itself will fall at the end of the tribulation period. And that will be the final fall. That will be when Isaiah 13:20 is really fulfilled, that nobody will ever even want to live there again. Nobody will even want to picnic there because it's just an utter devastating wasteland. But before it falls, okay? So during the tribulation period, apparently it becomes a site of great wealth and also great decadence. I think of like the big cities in America in the roaring 20s, like right before the Great Depression hit, If you ever, read The Great Gatsby or look into that time, a lot of people just thought like they can just party hard and they can party hard forever and life's never going to change. And like we're on top of the world. I mean, they really thought they had it made in the 1920s. But at the end of that decade, the Great Depression hit. And anyway, there's probably a lot of that parallel going on with Babylon. When Jesus said, it'll be as in the days of Noah, people will be eating and drinking and giving in marriage and planning for the future, and then sudden destruction will come upon them. And he could have been speaking about really what's going on specifically in the city of Babylon. And it says this in Revelation 18:9, talking about its fall. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. Now, some might say, well, wait a minute, Luke, wait. The kingdom of the Antichrist, I've always heard it was a revived Roman Empire. So what are you telling me right now that he's going to have his headquarters in Babylon? Babylon, Rome, those are two different things. Okay, well, let's put a few of these pieces together real quick. Here's a prophecy about the Antichrist from Revelation chapter 13. Hope I'm not going too fast for anybody. I feel like I'm going really speeding through this. And so if I am, you might have to go back and listen to some of this again. So I apologize if I'm going too quick. But Revelation 13, John the Revelator sees this vision of a great beast rising up out of the sea. And so it says this in Revelation 13:1, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. This is a vision of the Antichrist and of his empire. It says in verse 2, and the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to the dragon it gave its power and his throne and great authority. So John sees this beast coming up, and all this is, again, apocalyptic literature like Zechariah chapter 5, and all these elements of the vision that John is seeing, they relate to things about the future. These are symbols that are painting a picture of what the Antichrist kingdom is going to be like. And so it said he saw a beast rising out of the sea. It had 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And it said the beast was like a leopard. So that would, using the scripture to interpret scripture from the book of Daniel, the leopard actually represents Greece, one of those empires from world history. Then it said its feet were like a bear's. Well, again, from the book of Daniel, we learned that the bear is the animal symbol of the Persian Empire, that Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel had a dream of a bear that was bigger on one side than the other, and that was referring to the fact that there was this Medo-Persian Empire, but the Persians were bigger than the Medes, so it was a little bit misshapen bear. Well, this deformed bear represented Persia. And then John says its mouth was like a lion's mouth. The lion was, from the book of Daniel, that was the animal who is the symbol of Babylon. And so what am I saying here? The government of the Antichrist, it is going to be a revived Roman Empire, but it's also going to contain elements of past world empires. Okay, that's what Revelation 13 is showing us. So there's going to be some aspects of it that are going to be like Greece. There's going to be some aspects of it that are like Persia. And I think I would even say in a spiritual sense, we talk about sometimes principalities and how there are, you can call them demons or fallen angels, watchers, whatever you want to call them. But there's these, I'm not going to get into the weeds on that today, but there's these beings who are in charge of certain sectors of the earth. They are like the angel or the fallen angel in a lot of cases, the principality who is over a particular geographical area. And what I believe is kind of happening in the end times is that these various principalities are teaming up to create the empire of the Antichrist. And so that's why you're going to see elements of Greece and elements of Persia and elements of Babylon, because these principality spirits, they might have lost power all those thousands of years ago. They might have lost some dominance on the world scene, but those principalities are still alive, and they want a second go at it, and they'll team up to try to overthrow God and try to stop the second coming of Christ. And so these are all banding together to create the empire of the Antichrist in the last days. And I believe the part of it that's Babylonian, one of the parts at least, is that the Antichrist is actually going to go into the city of Babylon in the future and make that his headquarters. So there is still a plan for Babylon. Babylon is going to fall again. And this time when it falls, it's going to fall for good. All right, I know I've laid a lot on you. I still have a bit more because I wanted to get back to Zechariah. So we're going to go back to Zechariah. Let me check on the chat here. Just checking to see if we had. If you're watching along right now, go ahead and let us know where you're watching from, and would love to just to know, like, I guess where you're at. You don't have to give me any private information, but I'd just love to know where you're listening from. And great to have all of you with us today. So, all right, let me get into the second part of today's lesson. Let's get back to the book of Zechariah, and I want to review this vision that he saw, and I want to explain what I think is going on as we read this vision. So it said, let me pull the verses back up on the screen for you once again. Here we go. Then the angel who talked with me came forward and said to me, "Lift your eyes and see what this is that is going out." And I said, "What is it?" He said, "This is the basket that is going out." And he said, "This is their iniquity in all the land." And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket. And he said, "This is wickedness." And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. So remember in Zechariah's context, so he's part of that group who's been allowed to come back home. Israel has been in ruins. He's trying to motivate the people to get the walls and the city, the temple and all that stuff rebuilt. And so for the past 70 years, Babylon had permeated the land of Israel. I'm talking like geographically. And so what God is saying is like, I'm getting all this Babylon, all this evil out of my land. And it's all getting wrapped up and thrown in this basket. Okay, that's what's going on in the vision. And so in this vision, the evil of the land is represented by this woman who's been placed in the basket. She's meant to like embody, personify all the evil of the land. Now, why is God using a woman for the, it reminds me, just earlier today, my 7-year-old, I was trying to, it's kind of a long story. I was trying to explain to him about being grateful. And anyway, it just went from one thing to another, but he ended up, he was asking me if basically we can blame women for all the problems in the world because Eve was the one who sinned first. And I was like, well, and then I explained to him a little bit about male headship and male authority. And I was like, well, Eve might have sinned first, but Adam really should have been the man and put a stop to it. And anyway, it's kind of a long story, but he was just asking if we can just blame girls, basically. Because, he's 7, so he wants to say, the girls have cooties and girls are lame and you can blame girls for everything. So he's trying to ask if we can blame the fall of man on woman. And I was like, well, actually Adam had more responsibility even than Eve. He got in bigger trouble than Eve did. But I guess that's a lesson for another time. Anyway, that's not why this is a woman who represents all of the evil in Zechariah's basket right here, okay? The reason that there's this woman, I believe that this woman in the vision is actually meant to represent Semiramis. And so Semiramis is the quote-unquote goddess who was believed or said to have had a child with Nimrod. And Nimrod was the founder of Babylon. And so I do not believe this is a true story, by the way. I'm just telling you, like, this is what the ancient people believed. There was this ancient cult that they worshipped Semiramis as the queen of heaven back in ancient Mesopotamia. And God had another name for her. We're going to read it later, but she was called the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah 7, and I want to say chapter 44. And so there was this cult belief that Semiramis had a baby by Nimrod, and that this baby was named Tammuz. And you see this also in Ezekiel chapter 8, that the women were weeping for Tammuz in the temple of God. This was a very idolatrous thing to do. So anyway, Semiramis, I believe, since so much of the false worship of Babel, since it's centered around Semiramis, I think that's who this woman is really supposed to represent. Scripture doesn't say that, so that's just a little bit of my conjecture. But that's where you see this like ancient cult-like veneration of the quote-unquote Queen of Heaven in ancient times. It goes back to this false religion cult of Babylon and Semiramis and Tammuz. And so let's keep reading here in the vision what happened to her. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 2 women coming forward. The wind was in their wings. They had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between earth and heaven. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, where are they taking the basket? He said to me, to the land of Shinar, to build a house for it. And when this is prepared, they will set the basket down there on its base. So this is really unique because there's the 2 women there with wings like a stork. We hear 2 women with wings and we think, oh, he's talking about an angel. These are angels. I do not believe that these were angels, okay? For a few different reasons. One, angels in the Bible, in any other location of Scripture, they are only ever said to be male. So if these were female angels, like it would be the only ones in Scripture and it would kind of break the mold. It would kind of break the pattern. It doesn't call them angels right here. And, if we want to get really technical, most of the time when angels appear in the Bible, they are not even said to have wings. Most of the time they just look like ordinary people. And it's only the cherubim and I think the seraphim also who are said to have wings. So you wouldn't even just like assume just because you see a being with wings that it's necessarily an angel. That's kind of how in our modern times, because we have like the precious moments and all the artwork of the Renaissance period, and this is how they drew angels, so that's how we think of angels. Scripture never puts in a female angel. And furthermore, another reason I don't think that these are angels, the symbolism of a stork's wings, that is something that would, the idea here is something negative, okay? A stork was an unclean animal in the Israelite world. If you look at I think it's, Leviticus, is it 11 or 14 or maybe Deuteronomy 14? But in those chapters, like it talks about the dietary laws, and a stork is an unclean animal. So I do not take it that these women are meant to symbolize something good. And it said the women, let me find the verse here, the women carry off the basket, it said, to the land of Shinar in verse 11. There's a place being prepared for it in Shinar. So let's talk about what Shinar is. We see Shinar mentioned in Genesis 10. It's kind of a genealogy, and it's talking about how people spread out after the flood and where they set up civilizations after the flood. So it says Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. I think that's Gibborim in the Hebrew. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Oh, that's verse 9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Okay, so the land of Shinar, and he set up some cities there, and one of those cities was called Babel. Now, we know all about Babel because in the very next chapter, Genesis 11, we read about the tower that was built there. We won't read the whole story today, but it says Genesis 11, verses 1 through 3. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Okay, that was verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11. So again, Shinar, this is the location. We saw it mentioned in Zechariah 5. Shinar is the location that they said, send that woman and her basket back to Shinar and leave it there. There's a plan for it. It's going to wait there until the end times. Verse 3, at the Tower of Babel story. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And so, we won't read the whole thing. The people tried to build what's called a tower to heaven. And so God saw this. He says, we got to put a stop to this. And what God ended up doing was he mixed up all of their languages so that they couldn't understand each other. And I guess they had to give up and go home. And when they all went back home, that's how all the languages, like where tongues came from, is all the different tongues in the world. Before that, everybody spoke the same language, but now people couldn't understand each other, and that limited the capabilities of what mankind was able to achieve. And so verse 9 says, therefore, its name was called Babel. Because I think literally because when the people were trying to build this tower and they got all confused, they just heard babbling in their ears. They couldn't understand each other. Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So Shinar equals Babel. And in case you haven't put the pieces together, Babel, the city of Babel, that is the city of Babylon. All right? So that hopefully ties all this together. Babylon had its origins in Genesis chapter 11. And then this city is a major threat to God's people throughout the rest of the Old Testament until the Babylonian Empire falls in Daniel chapter 5. But what we learn from Zechariah's night vision is that there is being a place prepared for Babylon to rise again. Babylon is going to come back someday. And so, it's kind of interesting. Saddam Hussein tried to make Babylon come back already, and it was doing that for a few decades, and then that whole project kind of stalled. And here's a few reasons why. Again, thousands of people live there today, so it's not uninhabited today, but it's not to the glory that he tried to build it back to. So Saddam Hussein was all about, this is modern day Iraq, where Babylon is today. And Saddam Hussein was all about wanting to restore the glory of Babylon in modern times. I mean, I think it was really demonically fueled because like I was saying, there's principality spirits. There's a prince of Babylon, a spiritual prince, a spiritual authority over that land. And he wants to see his empire come back. And so he is, trying to pull the strings and orchestrate things behind the scenes to bring Babylon back to its former glory. And he got his talons into Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein was trying to get this done. However, he used the wrong bricks. So Saddam Hussein used a concrete. This is literally one of the reasons why his rebuilding project kind of fell apart, because literally his buildings were falling apart. He used concrete-based bricks, and in that climate of that area of the world, apparently concrete bricks don't do so well. And I found that fact really interesting because as you read about the Tower of Babel, what's one of the first things it tells you? It tells you about what kind of bricks they used. And so I thought that was interesting. Saddam Hussein used the wrong kinds of bricks. And so his reconstruction project was not successful. Another thing is it was kind of a passion project for him. He wanted his name imprinted on every single brick because he wanted this to be like his thing. And that was the same thing Nebuchadnezzar did thousands of years ago at the time of Babylon. That he had, I think I read somewhere how many millions of bricks he used. 60 million or billion bricks in Babel is what built Babylon thousands of years ago. And every single one of them had an inscription on it that said something like, this is the city of King Nebuchadnezzar. He rules from sea to sea. And he had that imprinted on every single brick. Well, Saddam Hussein wanted to do that too. Only Saddam Hussein ended up getting executed by his own people. And by the time he died, he was so unpopular that nobody really wanted to carry on his legacy. And part of his legacy was rebuilding the city of Babylon. However, the United Nations has an interest in preserving Babylon. It recognized Babylon with a protected status in 2019. And so what that means is Iraq is supposed to maintain the city of Babylon for the time being. They're not allowed to destroy it. So they have to keep it going. And it is my belief that Zechariah's seventh night vision, what this is trying to convey, is that God has a plan for Babylon to rise again someday. And we're kind of going to wind it down for today on the podcast. Next time I had wanted to get into Zechariah 6 and do that final night vision, but I feel like there's more that we could talk about in regard to Babylon. I want to flesh this out a little bit more because I've talked about how I believe God has a plan for Babylon in the end times. There is something coming down the road for it. But you might say, what? Like, what does it mean that this is the headquarters of the Antichrist empire? Let's talk about that next time on this show. So make sure you're subscribed. If you're not already, make sure you go hit that subscribe button. And if you want to get in touch with me in the meantime, my email is GodAndHisProphetsPodcast@gmail.com. That's just God and spelled out, GodAndHisProphetsPodcast@gmail.com. God.com, because there's an aspect of this vision I want to get back to. Let me pull up verses 7 and 8 again. Zechariah 5:7 said, "And behold, the leaden cover was lifted, and there was a woman sitting in the basket." Verse 8 told us, he said, "This is wickedness." And he thrust her back into the basket and thrust down the leaden weight on its opening. When it said this is wickedness, you might have noticed there is a capital W right there on that word, wickedness. And I looked it up in the Hebrew. This is the word rishah. It's a word that means wickedness, but it's used in a way here, like the way that he speaks it to her. They emphasize it by putting a capital letter on it in English, but in the Hebrew, it is basically denoting her as the personification of wickedness. Okay, so she's a symbol. Maybe she kind of represents Semiramis. That's why God used a woman. Doesn't necessarily mean she's a particular person. Maybe she represents a particular evil spirit who deceives people into a false worship, something like Ishtar. But this woman who is meant to represent wickedness, I believe she is the exact same woman that we see coming in Revelation 17, verses 1 through 3. Then this is a different vision of Revelation. John writes, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns." Well, we already saw this beast before. Okay, this is a different vision, but we saw this. This was the government of the kingdom of the Antichrist. In John's vision, now he sees a woman riding that beast. Well, she represents, I believe, she represents the wicked religion of the Antichrist. Satan's goal is not just government, that's earthly domination, but Satan's goal is spiritual domination, and he achieves that through religion. So the Antichrist and his government is really even just a tool that Satan is using for his real agenda, not just earthly domination, but spiritual domination. He wants to replace worship of God with worship of himself. And I believe that this woman is the personification of his false religion. She's also called at times the whore of Babylon, known as the woman who rides the beast. And she has a part to play in the picture that Revelation is painting for us. So I think I've talked long enough for today. It's gone a little bit longer than I usually do, and I have more to say on this subject, so we're going to come back next week. We're going to come right back here to Revelation 17, and we're going to try to understand this picture that John is painting for us in the book. So this has been Luke Taylor. I hope the Bible makes more sense to you after this episode, and that you see more clearly the story of God and his prophets.